There are places in this world that look peaceful from a distance, places with tall trees and clean air and the sound of water running over smooth stones, places that seem like they exist outside of time, untouched and quiet and safe. And most of the time, that's exactly what they are. Most of the time, the wilderness rewards the people who walk into it with something rare and beautiful. A sense of freedom. A sense of calm. A sense that the noise of the ordinary world has been left somewhere far behind. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the wilderness has something else waiting for the people who wander into it. Something that can't be explained away with logic or reason. Something that leaves a mark not just on the body, but on the mind and the soul. And the people who experience those moments, the ones who come face to face with the thing that hides behind the beauty, they never quite look at a tree line the same way again. They never quite feel at ease when the light starts to fade and the sounds of the forest begin to shift. They know what most people don't. That nature is not always kind. That the dark between the trees is not always empty. And that the most dangerous thing you might ever encounter out there in the wilderness might not have 4 legs and sharp teeth. It might walk on 2 legs just like you do. It might look completely ordinary in the daylight. And you might never see it coming until it's already too late. Tonight, we have 3 stories for you. 3 accounts from 3 different people who went out into the wilderness, whether for work or for pleasure, whether with a group or completely alone, and came back with something they never bargained for. A trail guide in Oklahoma who came face to face with a figure lurking in the darkness of his campsite. A wilderness guide whose camping trip with a lovely family turned into something deeply frightening and deeply strange when one of his guests wandered off in the night and came back changed in ways that no one could explain. And a guide near Mount Shasta who took the woman he was falling in love with out on a hike, only to realize, in one terrifying moment, that someone had been watching them the whole time. These are their words. These are their stories. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end of the last one, you are going to want to lock your doors and leave the lights on. So if you're new here and you've stumbled across this video for the very first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and join our community, because stories like these are what we do here, and you are absolutely going to want to stick around for what comes next. Now, let's begin. It was a long time ago now, so long ago that some of the details have softened around the edges the way old photographs do, but the feelings have never faded. Not even a little. The summer of 1995. I was young back then, full of energy and ambition, a college kid from a ranching background who had decided he was going to make his father proud by becoming a lawyer. I was studying at Texas A&M at the time, and when the opportunity came up to volunteer as a trail guide at the McCurtain County Wilderness area down in southeast Oklahoma, I didn't hesitate for a second. The university was covering my expenses, and it meant getting to spend my spring break out in the kind of landscape I'd grown up loving. Wide open, wild, and honest. I'd always been an outdoorsy kind of person. Growing up on the ranch my father worked, I learned early on how to read the land, how to move quietly through it, how to respect it. I was never a cowboy in the romantic Hollywood sense of the word, but I knew how to handle myself outdoors. I knew which end of a rifle the bullet came out of, and I knew how to listen when the land was trying to tell me something. There were plenty of times growing up when I thought I'd have been perfectly happy staying on that ranch forever, just to stay close to my family and the land I loved. But my father always dreamed of something more for me. He wanted me to go further than he had. And so, when the time came, I made the decision to honor that dream. I packed my bags, headed to Texas, and started building the future my father had imagined for me. But Oklahoma still had a hold on me. It always did. And the McCurtain County Wilderness area was about as Oklahoma as it got, about 14,000 acres of rugged, rolling mountain terrain that stretched all the way up to the Arkansas state line. It had thick stands of pine trees with cool, clean creeks running through them, and it was home to all kinds of wildlife. Deer picking their way through the underbrush. Turkeys moving in that funny, alert way they do. The occasional black bear, massive and silent, leaving tracks in the soft mud near the water. It was a prime spot for hiking and fishing and getting lost in a good way, the way that reminds you that you are small and the world is enormous, and that is perfectly fine. But not everyone feels comfortable venturing out into a place like that on their own, and that's where I came in. As a trail guide, I led groups along trails like the Beach Creek Loop or up to the overlooks where I could point out the native plant species and the birds and share a little of the deep, layered history of the region, because the roots of those hills go down a long, long way. And for the most part, every trip I took, including the solo ones, went without incident. The wilderness was generous to me. It let me in and let me back out again without asking for anything in return. But then there was one trip. One summer night in 1995 that was different from all the others. And it's the reason I'm telling you this story today. Part of my job as a trail guide wasn't just about leading groups through the trees. I also did campsite scouting, heading out ahead of time to identify safe, suitable locations for overnight camping trips, which were popular with both younger visitors and older ones. Scouting a campsite sounds simple, but it actually required a careful and systematic eye for detail. You needed a piece of ground that was flat and solid and wide enough to accommodate at least 4 or 5 tents comfortably. It couldn't sit in a low depression where rainwater might collect after one of those fast, furious storms that roll through that part of Oklahoma without much warning and turn the ground beneath you into a swamp overnight. The soil had to be firm and clear of debris. Overhead, you had to scan for what we called widow makers, dead branches or leaning trees weakened by rot or wind damage that could come crashing down on top of sleeping campers without so much as a warning sound. And because we were in bear country, you had to look carefully for signs of recent activity, scat, fresh tracks, areas where something heavy had been digging for grubs. If a site showed signs that bears were moving through it regularly, you moved on without a second thought. A bear encounter on an overnight trip with inexperienced campers was simply not a risk worth taking. Once a location passed all of those initial checks, once you had your flat ground, your clearance from overhead hazards, your proximity to water, and a decent natural space for a fire pit, you marked it on the map and then did what we called field testing. And field testing meant exactly what it sounded like. You went out there yourself, alone, and you spent the night. On this particular occasion, I was asked to check out a potential campsite in an area called He Creek, a runoff of the Mountain Fork River sitting about an 8 to 9 hour hike from our base. We didn't have many established sites in that part of the wilderness area, and there was real reason to believe that the terrain out there, with its intersecting bodies of water and its varied topography, might offer something special. So I set out early, hitting the trails at 7 in the morning, and I walked all day through some truly beautiful country. By the time I arrived at the spot I'd been aiming for, the light was starting to turn gold and long the way it does in late afternoon. And what I found was worth every single step. A small, flat peninsula, sitting on a gentle rise above the river, with clean sight lines in every direction and easy access to both the creek and the river below. It was perfect. Ideal for fishing and hunting, gentle enough near the creek for families with children, and with a natural clearing large enough for a solid group camp. I stood there for a few minutes just taking it in before getting to work. I set up my small one-man tent, got a fire going using the abundance of dry wood scattered around the area, cooked myself a simple campfire dinner, and then settled in for the night with a copy of Jack London's The Call of the Wild propped against my knees. I figured there was no more fitting book for a night like that one. I hadn't spotted any bear or cougar sign in the area, which was a genuine comfort. But I also knew that in the wilds of southeast Oklahoma, it wasn't only the large predators that demanded caution. The marshier regions of the southeast had been known to host the occasional alligator. Bobcats and coyotes could pose a real threat to small children. And then there were the feral hogs, animals capable of doing serious damage to just about anything that crossed their path, including full-grown adults and even vehicles. The wilderness at night is a living, breathing thing, and staying out there overnight was always the truest way to get a feel for what a campsite was really like once the sun went down and the world around it came alive. The fire was crackling warmly, my dinner was settling, and I was well into my book when I heard it. A sound, somewhere between 20 and 30 yards off through the trees. A rustling, a movement, the kind of low disturbance that the woods make sometimes and doesn't always mean anything at all. I didn't spook easily. I'd spent enough nights outdoors to know that forests are never truly silent after dark. Animals move through them constantly, raccoons and possums and deer and 100 other creatures going about their business in the dark. All you generally needed to do to make an animal aware of your presence was let it know you were there. So I looked up from my book and said simply, loud enough to carry, "Howdy, y'all." It was casual. Relaxed. And it worked. The sound stopped immediately, and for a couple of minutes, everything was quiet again. I assumed it had been a dead branch finally giving way from some overhead tree. I turned back to my book. But then I heard it again. And this time, it was closer. Something, or someone, was moving through the darkness toward me. Each sound was slightly nearer than the last. Slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there was in no particular hurry. Like it was taking its time. My hand went to my sidearm without me even consciously deciding to reach for it. I carried a Super Redhawk in .480 Ruger, a serious firearm with a little less recoil than the full power loads, and very much my first choice for situations where everything was about to go sideways. I held it steady and spoke again, louder this time, clear and firm. "You've got to be either real brave or real stupid to be sneaking up on someone who's out here camping after dark." It served a double purpose, letting an animal know I was not prey, and letting a person know that I was not someone to be trifled with. And then the sound came again, right at the edge of my firelight, from somewhere just behind a nearby tree. I pulled the hammer back on my Redhawk and leveled it at the trunk, my breathing uneven, my hands not as steady as I would have liked. I focused on calming down. I told myself that whatever it was, I was ready. But I wasn't ready. Because the next sound didn't come from in front of me. It came from my right, and it came fast. Whoever it was moved with a speed I hadn't anticipated. Before I could even turn to aim, I caught only a flash of something metallic catching the firelight. A blade. And then he was already swinging at me. I had no choice but to throw myself sideways, essentially diving over my own tent to put something, anything, between myself and that arc of shining metal. I heard him yell something as the swing missed me. And then by the time I'd come up on one knee, gun raised and heart slamming against my ribs, I could only see the back of him, already running, already disappearing into the dark between the trees. I aimed as steadily as I could manage and fired a single shot. The bang was enormous in the silence of the wilderness, and my ears rang badly in the aftermath. I waited for some sign that he'd been hit, a cry, a stumble, anything. But there was nothing. Just the fading sound of heavy footsteps moving away through the trees, getting quieter and quieter until they were gone entirely. I spent the rest of that night away from the campfire, positioned far enough back in the shadows to keep the whole site in view while remaining invisible myself. Packing up and heading back through the trees at night wasn't a real option. Moving through that terrain in the dark is a noisy business, and the last thing I wanted to do was give whoever was out there a clear way to track my movement. I sat with my pistol in my hand and my back against a solid tree trunk and waited for the dawn. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, I walked in the direction my attacker had run. And I found blood, a trail of it, leading through the undergrowth over a considerable distance. I followed it slowly and carefully, pistol ready, moving as quietly as I could, until the trail ended at a small cave set into a rock face, no taller than chest height, going back into the darkness further than my flashlight could reach. I stepped inside just far enough to check the immediate area. What I found in there told a story of its own, animal bones scattered across the cave floor, and pieces of camping trash mixed in among them. Empty food cans. Plastic water bottles. Evidence of someone living rough, out there in the wild, for what might have been a very long time. But whoever had been there wasn't there anymore. Or if they were hiding quietly in the very back of that cave, beyond where my light could reach, and choosing to stay perfectly still. I made it back to base about 9 hours later. Walked straight into my supervisor's office, and told him exactly what had happened. That was the day they stopped taking camping parties up near He Creek. The local sheriff told me I'd been well within my rights to fire and that he'd look into it, but that with so little to go on, there was a real chance they'd never find the man. Whether they followed up on the blood trail, whether they found any evidence at all out there, I honestly don't know. They may never have gone out there at all. What I do know is this. It was a reminder that the wilderness is never quite as empty as it looks. The bears and the hogs and the alligators, those are the dangers people think about when they head into wild country. But sometimes, the thing you really need to worry about is something altogether different. Sometimes, out there in the middle of nowhere, it's not the animals. It's the men. If any of what you just heard felt close to home, if you've ever had a moment out in the wild that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, drop it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your experience. And if you haven't already, please take a second to like this video and share it with someone you think would love these stories. It genuinely means the world to us. Now, our next story. I'm not going to pretend that the path that brought me to work as a wilderness guide was a straight one. It wasn't. It was about as winding and difficult as a trail can get. I grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and drifted out west in my teens the way a lot of restless young people do, chasing something I couldn't quite name, not realizing I was heading in the wrong direction entirely. I got hooked on heroin. I made choices that I'm not proud of. And eventually, I served time in federal prison, which was, without question, the lowest point of my life. I got through my sentence without taking any kind of serious beating, and I came out the other side in one piece. But when I walked out of those doors, I knew, with a clarity that I hadn't felt in years, that I had to build something completely different. For the first time in my adult life, I had to sit down and actually think about what I wanted my future to look like. And what kept coming back to me, every single time I thought about it, was the outdoors. Being outside. Having space and sky above me and ground beneath my feet. After my time locked inside concrete walls, the idea of spending my working life out in the open felt like the closest thing to a miracle I could imagine. The problem was obvious. Becoming a park ranger or a forest ranger as a convicted felon was essentially a closed door. But wilderness firefighting, now that was a different story. Agencies did allow people with nonviolent felony convictions to apply for those positions, and I was seriously considering it when life handed me an unexpected turn. I stopped into a bar one Thursday evening for a couple of beers, got to talking with a man at the counter, and by the end of the conversation, he was telling me about his cousin, a man who ran a tour company out in the Patton Wilderness. He asked if I'd be interested. And when I said yes, he told his cousin. His cousin called me the very next day. My future boss was honest with me from the start. He said he was willing to give me a chance, but that he wasn't going to pay me for the privilege of proving myself. He'd give me a place to stay, keep me fed and clothed and looked after, but the first couple of months would be unpaid, a trial period to show him I was serious and steady and reliable. He told me this like it might be a deal-breaker. What he didn't know, what I never told him, was that in that moment, I would have happily worked for free for an entire year if it meant having the life I was being offered at the end of it. I accepted without hesitation and made my way to a small town called Barron, tucked into the hills in that part of the wilderness. I didn't know what to expect. But what I found when I arrived was more comfortable and more welcoming than anything I'd imagined. The guides shared a set of well-equipped cabins with full amenities, 4 other guides in total, not counting the boss who lived further down in Wilshire. There were 3 cabins, and since I was new, and since the others weren't quite sure what to make of me yet, probably because the boss had told them about my background, I had one of the cabins to myself for a while. I understood completely. Trust has to be earned. I knew that better than most. And so I got to work earning it. The rhythm of that place suited me in ways I hadn't expected. The work itself was endlessly varied, tourists wanting a classic wilderness experience, adventure vacation types who needed someone to make sure they didn't accidentally step off a cliff. Corporate team-building groups who were more interested in their evening bonfire than the trail itself, bachelor parties that were long on enthusiasm and short on practical skills. I learned quickly how to read different groups and give each one what they actually needed, not just what they asked for. And as people watched me work, as they saw how seriously I took the job, how genuinely I cared about the safety and the experience of every person I guided, I started making friends. The trust built slowly and honestly, the way good things do. By the time my trial period was finished and I was a fully trained, fully paid member of the guiding team, I felt like I had genuinely become a different person. A better one. And it was in that chapter of my life that I met a family I will never, ever forget. Their names aren't important for our purposes here, except for the grandmother, the one who held the whole family together like a warm, bright thread through a piece of cloth. Her name was Patty. She and her husband were somewhere in their 60s, maybe touching 70, and they'd brought their 2 grown children with them for a shared outdoor adventure. They told me they'd raised those kids on concrete, city sidewalks and shopping malls and apartment buildings, and they wanted them to experience something real. Something that connected them to the natural world. The moment I laid eyes on them at the trailhead, I knew we were going to have a wonderful couple of days together. They were, without exaggeration, the most wholesome family unit I had ever guided. The love between them was the kind that doesn't perform itself, it just exists, easy and comfortable and deep. They teased each other constantly in the way that people do when they're genuinely at ease with one another. Patty in particular was a ray of absolute sunshine. She had a laugh that carried through the trees and a curiosity about everything around her that made the whole hike feel fresh and alive. She had stories to tell, good ones, and she listened just as enthusiastically to everyone else's. I remember thinking that if I had 100 clients like her, I would have considered myself the luckiest guide alive. We hiked for most of the day, stopping when we needed to rest and refuel, taking our time and enjoying the world around us. By the time we reached the campsite for the night, everyone was pleasantly tired in that good, honest way that only a long day in the fresh air can produce. We got the fire going, Patty's son helped me with that part, and then Patty herself insisted on taking over the cooking duties so I could sit down and rest my legs. She produced a campfire meal that put most of what I usually manage to shame. We set up the 2 family tents and my small personal one, went over the standard safety procedures in case anything happened overnight, and then one by one we retired to our sleeping bags. I had no reason to believe that night would be anything other than peaceful. I was completely, utterly wrong. I woke to the sound of voices, urgent, hushed voices, and the blinding sweep of flashlight beams across the walls of my tent. When I unzipped the flap and looked out, I saw Patty's husband, her son, and her daughter standing outside their tents in their nightclothes, their faces drawn tight with something that sat somewhere between confusion and fear. Patty herself was nowhere to be seen. The 3 of them were whispering at first, not wanting to accept out loud what had already become obvious. But when they heard me asking what was wrong, they told me straight. Patty was gone. She'd vanished from the camp. Her husband explained what he knew. He had woken to small sounds of movement from the sleeping bag beside him and assumed Patty was simply shifting in her sleep the way older joints sometimes demand. He'd spoken to her quietly, asked if she was all right. When she didn't answer, he reached over, and found empty fabric and nothing else. The front flap of their tent was unzipped. His wife was gone. He'd already circled the immediate camp area looking for her, hoping she'd simply stepped away for a bathroom break and would reappear any moment. She hadn't. And then when he woke the kids, they noticed something that made everyone's stomach sink a little more. Patty hadn't taken her shoes. We organized quickly. Each of us took a compass direction, flashlights in hand, and fanned out from the camp calling her name, loudly, clearly, without stopping. We kept each other's lights in view at all times so that no one drifted too far out. We expanded the perimeter gradually, pushing perhaps 100 meters out in each direction, calling and calling into the darkness. The wilderness absorbed every shout. Patty didn't respond. After a careful assessment, I made the call to bring everyone back to camp. The priority now had to be contacting the local park rangers and getting a proper search organized, while also getting the family safely back to headquarters. Patty's son did not take that well. He came at me with a ferocity born from terror and love, insisting that we stay, that we keep searching, that leaving felt like abandonment. His father backed him up. The feeling in the camp was raw and tight with emotion. And I understood it completely. If that had been my mother out there in the dark, I would have felt exactly the same way. So I made a compromise that I think was the right one. While I began packing up the campsite and preparing for our return, I told Patty's son that I wouldn't stop him if he wanted to make one final sweep of the perimeter with his father. He grabbed his flashlight before I'd even finished the sentence. Patty's daughter stayed with me. She was holding herself together by the thinnest possible thread, and I focused on keeping her calm and giving my hands something useful to do with the packing. I didn't believe they would find her. The wilderness had taken people before, and the wilderness is not in the habit of giving them back quickly. The cynicism that builds in a guide over time is not comfortable, but it is honest. And then, maybe 10 minutes after the two men left, I heard the son's voice cutting through the trees. "We got her." Just those 3 words. But they hit me like a wave breaking. Patty's daughter collapsed into tears. I'm not going to tell you I stayed completely dry-eyed myself. I was not far from it. They came back through the tree line, Patty's husband and son supporting her between them. She was on her feet, she was physically unharmed, and she seemed to have no significant injuries. But she was visibly shaken, quiet in a way that felt wrong on a person who'd been so warm and talkative just hours before. When her son kept asking where she'd gone, what had happened, she couldn't tell him. "I don't know," she kept saying. "I can't remember. I think I got lost." Her voice was flat and small. I didn't want to alarm the family any further, so I gently suggested that Patty would likely be more herself once she'd had some rest and some food in the morning. She'd walked off in pitch dark without a flashlight. Disorientation and shock were completely natural responses. We got everyone settled, got a few more hours of broken sleep, and waited for the dawn. But morning did not bring the comfort I'd hoped for. We woke at 6:30, packed up, and began the trek back. Patty was given coffee and a protein bar like everyone else, and at first she seemed quiet but functional. I asked if she was feeling all right. She said she was. She apologized for frightening everyone. She seemed, in her quiet way, like herself, though some essential brightness had been dimmed overnight, like a light bulb turned down low. I didn't push her. I assumed she was processing. I assumed the emotions would settle on the walk back. We were barely 20 minutes into the hike when things began to fall apart. The morning was still and clear. You could hear every bird call, every twig snap, every whispered conversation. Patty and her husband had fallen to the back of the group, walking quietly together, and I could just make out the low murmur of their voices behind me. Then her husband's tone changed. He said something sharp and controlled, the voice of a man keeping his patience through visible effort. Something like, "What did you say? No. Don't. We'll talk about this later." Not raised. Not explosive. Just tight and firmly closed. I didn't intervene. Small disagreements are a natural part of guiding people through exhaustion and stress and unfamiliar terrain. You let them breathe. You don't pour water on sparks that haven't yet become a fire. But what happened next was not a spark. A couple of minutes later, Patty's husband spoke again, louder now, the control slipping. "Patty, I told you. Not now. Later." And then Patty answered him. Her exact words, and I have never forgotten them, were, "We'll talk about it, and then we'll go running off into the arms of one of your whores." The air went out of the entire hike. Her son and daughter both reacted with visible shock, gasping, asking their mother what on earth she was talking about. And I felt it too, because this was the same woman who had sat by the fire the night before making all of us laugh until our sides ached. The same woman who'd fed us from a campfire like we were guests at her table. Whatever was coming out of her mouth right now bore absolutely no resemblance to the person I had spent the past 24 hours walking beside. She went on a long and venomous tirade, accusations about her husband's faithfulness. Years of perceived betrayal laid out in ugly, pointed detail. Her husband, jaw clenched, eventually snapped at her to stop. She fell silent. I turned around and, walking backwards for a moment, asked them all as gently and firmly as I could to just keep moving, to focus on getting back to base. When I looked at Patty's face expecting to find anger or tears, what I found instead stopped me cold. She was smiling. Broadly. Ear to ear. Like whatever she'd just said and the damage it had done was the most satisfying thing she'd experienced in years. I dropped back and fell into step beside her son. I told him, quietly, what I was thinking. Dramatic, sudden personality changes like the ones we've been seeing, the nighttime wandering, the missing memory, and now this, could be signs of a serious head injury. Even a fall in the dark without obvious external trauma could cause internal damage. He listened carefully, nodding slowly, and said he knew, he worked in personal injury law and he understood the connection. But he also pointed out what I already knew. We had checked Patty over the night before. We'd looked at her scalp carefully. There was no bump. No cut. No bruising. Nothing to suggest impact. Even so, the conclusion was the same. She needed a hospital. Immediately. But before we could get her there, things deteriorated sharply. Patty's venom turned toward her children. She began dragging up old grievances, old events, old fights, and then twisting them into something darker and uglier than anything that had actually happened. She accused her son of criminal behavior during his college years. He was absolutely shaking, telling her through clenched teeth that what she was saying could ruin him professionally if anyone heard it. And then she turned on her daughter, and what she said to that young woman was so vicious, so unfounded, and so cruel that her daughter broke down in tears, asking through them what had happened to her mother, where her mother had gone. I stepped in. I had to. I asked Patty, as calmly and politely as I could manage, if she would please just hold off on the arguments until we were safely back at base. And she looked at me, directly, steadily, with those wide smiling eyes, and told me to shut up, using language that I will not repeat here, and threatened to have her husband physically harm me. Her husband turned to me instantly, horrified, and told me absolutely that would not happen. But then turned back to his wife and began shouting at her in a way that told me this was a man at the absolute end of his tether, a man watching someone he loved say and do things he simply could not comprehend. And then it got worse. After a brief, exhausted lull in which we all caught our breath and collected ourselves, Patty's husband screamed my name from behind me. I spun around. Patty had a rock in her hand, not a small one. A serious, heavy rock. And she was swinging it at her husband's face. All three of us, me, her son, her daughter, moved at once. Her son grabbed her by the arms. Her daughter yanked the rock away. And together they brought her down to the ground, as carefully and gently as the struggle allowed. Patty fought them the whole way down. Kicking. Flailing. At one point trying to bite her own son's arm. Her husband stood a few feet away, the color drained completely from his face, looking at his wife like he was seeing a stranger. I told the family to hold her steady and not let her run. Then I dropped my pack, told them I would be back as fast as humanly possible, and ran. I mean that literally. I ran the entire route back to headquarters at a steady, hard jogging pace, and by the time I arrived I was gasping and bent double, barely able to get the words out clearly enough to describe what was happening back on the trail. We had an ATV with a medical transport trailer attached for situations exactly like this. A coworker grabbed the keys and we drove back out as fast as the terrain allowed. When we reached them, the scene had changed. Patty was still on the ground, but she was no longer struggling. The rage and the venom seemed to have burned themselves out. She looked exhausted, pale and hollow and small. There was evidence nearby that she had been vomiting. When I called her name, she looked up at me with eyes that seemed genuinely confused about where she was and how she'd gotten there. "I'm sorry," she kept saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened." Her son pulled me aside. His voice was quiet and frightened. "I think she's losing her mind," he said. I tried to reassure him that sudden behavioral changes like these, while alarming, usually had a physical explanation, and that the most important thing right now was getting her medical attention. He nodded. And then he told me something that I found genuinely unsettling. He had spoken to his mother while she was lying on the ground, asked her, gently, if she was feeling any better, and she had not responded. He thought she was ignoring him and pressed her, a little frustrated. And when she finally looked at him, there was a confusion in her eyes that went deeper than fog or exhaustion. It was as if, for a moment, she didn't fully understand who he was to her. As if the word "mom" required an explanation. We contacted emergency services the moment we were back within range. Given the remoteness of the location and the seriousness of Patty's condition, an air ambulance was dispatched. I have never seen a helicopter hover that low before or since. Patty was loaded in and lifted away, her family going with her, and within minutes they were gone from the clearing. All I could do was watch them go and tell them, before they left, that I would be thinking of them. That our doors were always open. We never heard from them again. But I think about Patty more often than she could ever know. I think about her barefoot in the darkness, walking away from the warmth of the fire and the people who loved her, out into a forest she didn't know, without a light or a voice to guide her back. I think about what might have been pulling her forward in that moment, whether it was fear or confusion or something happening deep inside her mind that none of us had the tools to understand. Psychologists talk about fugue states, those rare, disorienting episodes where a person's consciousness seems to slip sideways, where the mind retreats and the body keeps moving on its own, like a ship sailing without a captain. Some of us talked about it afterward, wondering if that was what had happened to Patty. Wondering if she'd taken a fall in the dark that triggered something none of us had been able to detect. But we never knew. We only had our guesses. And guesses are not answers. I hope she was all right. I hope she got the care she needed and that her family got some clarity and some peace. I hope that the Patty who loved to cook over a campfire and laugh until the trees shook, I hope she came back to them. Because the thought that she didn't is one of the things that, even now, keeps me awake some nights. We'll be right back with one final story. But first, if this is the kind of storytelling you love, please take just a moment to hit the like button. It helps more people find these stories, and it lets us know you want to hear more. We're so grateful for every single one of you who watches, shares, and keeps this community alive. The third story begins the way a lot of good things do, with an unexpected friendship and a long, comfortable conversation in a bar. I'd been working as a wilderness guide near Mount Shasta, California, for about 3 months when I met Noah. I'd relocated from Minnesota, which meant I didn't know a single soul in the area outside of my coworkers, and since the town around Shasta is largely made up of tourists and people passing through, I'd gotten in the habit of driving down to Redding when I wanted to spend time with people who were actually putting down roots somewhere. That's how I ended up in a bar one Saturday afternoon watching the Vikings game, and that's how I ended up talking to a young woman with deep brown eyes and an easy laugh who told me the color of her eyes came from the Italian side of her family. Her name was Noah. We exchanged numbers before the game was over. Over the following weeks, coffee turned into drinks, drinks turned into longer evenings, and longer evenings started to quietly mean something. She was bright and curious and funny, and she thought it was genuinely wonderful that I got to spend my working hours out in the natural world. Somewhere along the way it occurred to me, with a small sting of disbelief at my own oversight, that I had never once suggested taking her out on a trail. She'd been hearing me talk about the wilderness for weeks and I'd never offered to show it to her. She beat me to it. Noah asked if she could drive up to Shasta sometime to see where I worked and what I actually did with my days. I said yes immediately and spent the rest of the conversation mentally planning the best route, the best timing, all of it. She drove up on a beautiful morning. We put together a simple picnic and drove out to the trailhead near the upper sand flat, and then we stepped off the road and into the trees. The moment we did, I felt that shift that always happens when you leave the paved world behind, the way the air changes, the way sound becomes gentler and more layered, the way your entire body seems to exhale. I loved sharing that feeling with someone who hadn't experienced it before. I walked her through everything I knew and loved about that stretch of country. I told her about the ringtail, that small, magical creature somewhere between a fox and a squirrel that the old gold prospectors used to keep as pets, not for the charm of it but because ringtails were extraordinary at driving rats out of their camps. I talked about how wolves had been reintroduced to the region and how that had slowly, carefully brought the deer population back into natural balance. I told her about the prairie falcons, those impossibly fast hunters who could reach 200 miles an hour in a dive. And then I told her about one of my favorite behavioral quirks in all of nature, the flagging of the black-tailed deer, how that flash of white underside is a wordless signal passed silently between animals, a kind of biological traffic light that said something was wrong before anyone had to run. She lit up at that one. It was exactly the kind of thing that made her eyes go wide and thoughtful. We walked for several miles, talking the whole way, and when we stopped for our picnic I kept going. I told her about the California pitcher plant, one of the strange carnivorous species that grow in the wet, mineral-poor soils of the mountain. And I told her about the matsutake mushroom, the deeply prized ingredient in Japanese cuisine that growers had been attempting to introduce to the region, and the extraordinary patience that effort required, since the fungus can take up to 100 years to form the complex, intimate relationship with the roots of pine trees that allows it to eventually fruit. The people working to introduce it would never live to see it succeed. They were doing it entirely for generations they would never meet. Noah and I sat with that thought for a while. There was something about it that felt important. Something quietly beautiful about planting a seed you know you'll never see bloom. And then Noah said something that stopped my train of thought completely. She was looking out at the trees, relaxed and happy, and she said something along the lines of, "My dad would absolutely love this. We should bring him up here sometime." She said it casually, easily, like it was the most natural thought in the world. But it hit me squarely in the chest because she was talking about introducing me to her father. In the easy, offhand way you only do when you're certain about a person. I went quiet for what felt like the first time in hours. And it felt amazing. We talked for a little while after that about more personal things, family, history, what we hoped for. The conversation went deeper and softer than it had before, the way conversations do when the pretenses start to fall away and you realize you're genuinely comfortable with someone. It was, I can say without hesitation, the best date I had ever been on. I was doing something I was passionate about, in a place I loved, with someone I cared about more with every passing hour. And then the afternoon arrived and the heat built up and we both needed a bathroom break. We agreed, as sensibly as two adults on a hiking trail do, to simply step off the trail in opposite directions. I went left into a stand of trees. Noah went right, up a steep slope that leveled off at the top, giving her enough distance and privacy from the trail below. I figured we'd be separated for a few minutes at most. When I got back to the trail before she did, I wasn't worried. I gave it another minute. Then another. Then I took a few steps up the slope, not far, just enough to be heard, and called her name. Silence. Not a reply. Not a rustling in the undergrowth. Not even the faint sound of someone moving around up there. Just silence. And something in that silence was immediately and completely wrong. I climbed to the top of the slope and looked across the leveled ground into the trees beyond. Noah was not there. The space where she should have been was simply empty. My mind tried to find rational explanations. She'd walked further into the trees for privacy, she hadn't heard me, she would appear any second from behind one of those trunks. But the panic was already rising, faster than reason could hold it down. I called her name again. Nothing. And then she screamed. It was not the sound of someone who had twisted an ankle. It was not surprise or mild fright. It was a scream from the bottom of the lungs, the kind that the body produces when it is genuinely, desperately, absolutely terrified. And I was moving before I had consciously decided to move, sprinting toward the sound, then stopping myself hard. I tore open my backpack and went straight for the interior pouch where I kept my .45. I hadn't told Noah I was carrying. She was firmly against firearms and I hadn't wanted to make an issue of it on what was supposed to be a beautiful day. But I also wasn't about to walk a trail in that kind of remote country without a way to protect us if something went wrong. Standing there with her scream still echoing in my memory, I was intensely grateful for that decision. I ran into the trees with the gun drawn, calling Noah's name as I moved. She didn't answer. I kept going, head moving constantly, scanning everything around me. And then I saw them. A man was dragging Noah across the forest floor by her hair. And the thing that hit me like ice water, the thing that was somehow worse than the scenario itself, was how ordinary he looked. I had braced myself for some kind of monstrous figure. The instinct, the nightmare logic of the moment, told me whatever was out there should be enormous and inhuman. But the man I was looking at wore a blue t-shirt and khaki shorts. He had tan hiking boots on with colorful socks turned down at the top. He looked like someone you'd see on any trail, on any day. Average. Unremarkable. Just a man. A completely ordinary man dragging a semi-conscious woman by her hair across the forest floor. Our eyes met. And I could see in his face that he was afraid. Good. He should have been. I leveled my gun at him and screamed at him to let her go. He froze for a fraction of a second. And then, instead of releasing her and running, he did something that would have been almost laughable under any other circumstances. He doubled down. He started pulling her harder, faster, trying to haul her away through the trees while I stood there with a gun pointed at him. It was absurd. It was frantic. It was the behavior of a person so fixated on what he was doing that his self-preservation instinct had simply stopped functioning. I yelled again. Let her go or I would shoot. He stopped and looked at me again. And I began to squeeze the trigger. And I couldn't do it. I want to be clear, I know how to shoot. I knew I had the range and the angle. I knew that the relative positions of Noah and the man made a clean shot more than possible. But something locked in me at that moment. Some deep, primal doubt. What if something moved at the wrong instant? What if I misjudged by a fraction? The voice in my head was loud and insistent and it said don't. And I froze. He saw it. He watched the hesitation move across my face and he understood what it meant. The terror in his eyes settled into something calmer, something calculated. He turned his head to check the way ahead of him, and he kept dragging her. And that was what broke the paralysis. Not the anger. Not the fear. But watching him move again with Noah in his grip while I stood there doing nothing. I couldn't fire directly at him. But I could fire above him. A warning shot, well above both of them, completely safe, but close enough to make the point unmistakably clear. I aimed high and pulled the trigger. The sound exploded through the trees. He lurched, stumbled, spun toward me with pure terror written all over his face. And I told him, clearly, firmly, with every ounce of conviction I had, that if he did not let her go immediately, the next bullet would find him. It was the most composed I had sounded in that entire encounter. And it was enough. He released Noah's hair, turned, and ran. He disappeared into the trees within seconds. I rushed forward and knelt beside her. Noah was half-conscious, trying to understand where she was and what had just happened. She had taken 2 blows to the jaw, the first while she was still standing, which was when she screamed. The second had knocked her briefly unconscious. There was blood from the inside of her mouth. Her eyes were struggling to focus. I helped her sit up, then carefully to her feet, then got her back to the trail and sat her down again. And as reality returned to her, she started crying. She went back and forth between apologizing and thanking me, neither of which she had any need to do. I held her steady and told her the man was gone and that we needed to get moving, at whatever pace she could manage, because the longer we stayed, the more chance he had of regrouping and coming back. We were moving again within moments, alternating between jogging and walking, and somewhere in the rhythm of movement Noah found enough calm to tell me exactly what had happened. She had walked up the slope and gone far enough into the trees to have her privacy. She was buttoning up again when she heard something moving close to her, close enough that she went still and silent, straining to understand what it was. When she heard me call her name from the trail, she was too frightened to call back. Her instinct told her that answering would let whatever was close to her locate her. She stayed frozen. And then she heard footsteps, fast, heavy, certain, and she turned. The first blow connected before she could do anything. She screamed. The second knocked her into darkness. Her injuries, mercifully, were less severe than they could have been. The bruising was significant and it took time for the inside of her mouth to heal, but her jaw was not fractured and her teeth survived intact. The thought of what might have happened if that man had gotten her to wherever he intended to take her, that thought is one I have never allowed myself to sit with for too long. It goes to places I don't want to follow. We filed a police report at the Shasta Police Department the same day Noah was discharged from the hospital. It was hard for her, having to relive it so quickly, with so much clinical and official formality, but we both agreed it was the right thing to do while everything was still vivid and fresh. The police told us they'd made an arrest. They brought us in to look at a booking photo. The man in it had a long history of violent offenses. But Noah looked at that photo carefully, and we both agreed, it wasn't him. The man who had taken hold of her in those trees was not the same person looking back at us from that photograph. The case, to my knowledge, never went any further than that. What happened on that trail affected Noah for a long time afterward. She had nightmares about the man's face appearing in unexpected places, in reflections, around corners, in crowds. I made myself as present and available as I possibly could. I showed up. I listened. I stayed. And somehow, in the strange, complicated way that life sometimes works, that terrible experience drew us closer together than anything else could have. It stripped away everything surface level and left only what was real. Noah and I are still together now, coming up on 7 years. And this year, I'm finally going to do the right thing. I'm going to ask her to marry me. I want to spend the rest of my life being the person who shows up for her, the same way I did that day on the mountain, and every day since. And on that note, that's where we'll leave things for tonight. 3 stories. 3 very different people. 3 encounters with the wilderness that none of them will ever forget. What struck me most, reading all 3 of these accounts, is that same thread running through all of them, the idea that the wild places of this world are beautiful and important and worth seeking out. But they are never, ever empty. And the people who come back from those places with stories like these never quite look at a tree line the same way again. If you've had an experience like any of these, out on a trail, in the woods, anywhere in the wild, we would absolutely love to hear about it in the comments. This community has the most thoughtful, warm, and genuine people in it, and your stories matter to us more than you know. And if this video moved you or gave you something to think about, please share it with someone who loves stories like these. It's one of the most meaningful things you can do to support what we're building here together. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss a new story when it drops. And for those of you who've been here a while, thank you. From the bottom of my heart. You are the reason we do this. We'll see you in the next one.